On the night of the 14th of November 1940, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft circled over what appeared to be the de Havilland aircraft factory at Hatfield. Smoke billowed from a gaping hole in the roof. The factory, which had been churning out mosquito bombers at an alarming rate for the German High Command, now looked devastated. Mission accomplished. The reconnaissance photographs were marked severely damaged, and the site was downgraded from a critical target to destroyed infrastructure. German bomber crews, their folders thick with target priorities, were redirected elsewhere. Meanwhile, inside that supposedly shattered building, workers continued assembling mosquitoes at full capacity. The smoke, stage effects, the hole in the roof, carefully painted canvas. An illusionist had spent 3 days arranging the scene. The Germans never came back. This wasn't a fortunate coincidence. This was British camouflage doctrine working exactly as intended. Whilst Luftwaffe intelligence had spent years cataloguing British industrial sites with Teutonic precision, photographing every factory, annotating every warehouse, measuring every runway, British camoufleurs were learning to lie with paint, canvas and a healthy dose of theatrical audacity. By the war's end, 237 Starfish sites protecting 81 locations had diverted 730 bombing raids, with conservative estimates suggesting 968 tons of German ordnance fell on empty moorland instead of working factories. The entire Rolls-Royce engine works in Derby had its roof painted to resemble a village, complete with a chapel that workers continued to reference decades later. And in what might be the war's most ambitious deception, entire industrial sites simply disappeared beneath fake streets, parks and residential neighbourhoods. On paper, this shouldn't have worked. German intelligence was meticulous. They'd photographed Britain from Orkney to Cornwall before the war even started. Airships in the 1930s had sold souvenir copies of reconnaissance photos to the British public to cover costs. Luftwaffe target folders included annotated aerial photographs with precise locations, measurements, and German descriptions like Flugzeugzellenfabrik, aeroplane factory. The Gloucester Aircraft Company's factories, clearly labelled Altswerk and Neues Werk on German maps, had their exact positions marked in red. The British knew the Germans knew, so how do you hide something the enemy has already seen? You don't. You make it look like something else, or you make something else look like it. Standard military thinking in 1939 emphasised hardened defences. The French had their Maginot Line, the British had their pillboxes, over 6,000 reinforced concrete structures positioned across potential invasion routes. But Colonel John Fisher Turner, a Royal Engineers officer who'd spent decades as the Air Ministry's Director of Works and Buildings, understood something his contemporaries didn't. You couldn't armour a factory roof. A single Heinkel He-111 bomber carried 2,000 kilograms of ordnance. The Coventry raid on 14th to 15th November 1940 saw 449 bombers drop 394 tons of high explosives and 56 tons of incendiary bombs. No amount of concrete could protect against that. Defence was impossible. Deception was not. In September 1939, Turner was tasked with establishing decoy programs. His headquarters? Sound City Film Studios at Shepperton in Surrey. Not a military installation, not a government research facility, a film studio. The choice was deliberate and brilliant. Film crews understood something military engineers didn't. Reality is what the eye believes, not what actually exists. Sets looked authentic because lighting, texture and shadow created conviction. A painted backdrop became a cityscape, plywood became marble, canvas became stone. And most crucially, audiences never suspected unless the illusion broke. Turner recruited scenic designers, art directors, lighting experts, carpenters, animators, and prop men from Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Disney Studios, 20th Century Fox, Paramount, Universal and other Hollywood studios. These weren't soldiers playing at art. These were professionals who'd spent careers making audiences believe the impossible. They brought skills military doctrine had never considered: forced perspective, texture painting, material simulation, and lighting theory. A factory roof wasn't just painted green, it was painted to look like fields from 12,000 feet at dawn when bombers approached. It was painted to account for moonlight, cloud cover, and the oblique viewing angles of aircraft approaching at 180 knots. The secret was in understanding what German bomber crews actually saw. From 12,000 feet, a typical bombing altitude, even a trained eye had perhaps 10 to 15 seconds to identify a target before the bomb aimer had to release. Navigation relied on ground features: rivers, railway lines, distinctive buildings, and the patterns of streets. Factories were identified by their shape, size, the regularity of their roofs, and, critically, their contrast with surroundings. A vast expanse of uniform grey roofs screamed factory to any pilot with functioning eyes. But break up that regularity with painted hedge lines, add texture that mimicked agricultural patterns, blur the edges where building met ground, and suddenly the eye found nothing to grab onto. This wasn't accidental trickery. It was systematic exploitation of human perception. Tests at the Paint Research Station in Teddington determined that bituminous emulsions worked best on felted roofs, whilst oil-bound water paints, essentially sophisticated distempers, withstood weathering on concrete and corrugated iron. Earth-coloured pigments were sourced domestically when overseas supplies were threatened, documented in Geological Survey Wartime Pamphlet Number 21. The British Standards Institution standardised camouflage colours in BS 987C, 1942, specifying blacks, browns, greens and dull tones that matched British terrain. This wasn't guesswork, it was science in service of deception. What made this work wasn't any single technique, but rather the systematic application of multiple deception principles simultaneously. Take the Rolls-Royce factory in Derby, manufacturer of the Merlin engine that powered Spitfires, Hurricanes and Lancasters. The Germans knew exactly where it was. They bombed it at least twice. But instead of the concentrated destruction that flattened Coventry, the Derby work survived with what military analysts termed acceptable losses. 23 workers died in a January 1942 raid when a single aircraft struck part of the complex. But the factory kept running, engines kept shipping, and the Luftwaffe never launched the sustained assault the site warranted. The roof camouflage was executed by Ernest Townsend, a local artist who transformed the industrial complex into a village scene visible from the air. This wasn't impressionistic dabbling. The painting accounted for the geometry of aerial perspective. Rooflines were broken up with painted trees and hedgerows. Open spaces became painted gardens. The regularity that defined factory from above was methodically destroyed. Shadows were painted where buildings should cast them, creating false depth that confused range estimation. The eye, searching for the characteristic patterns of industry, found only the irregular hodgepodge of rural architecture. Similar techniques protected the Gloucester Aircraft Company's factories, despite German intelligence having them precisely mapped. Yadon Aerodrome, opened in 1931 as a civilian airport and requisitioned during the war, had its hangars camouflaged with woodland patterns, whilst fake hedges, made from cardboard, were positioned around them. From above, hangars resembled forest thickets. Runways received painted rural paths and artificial grasses. Rivers were camouflaged by covering sections with raised netting, painted to match the water below, breaking up the distinctive linear features that served as navigation aids. The Avro factory north of Yadon, manufacturer of the Lancaster bomber, employed particularly sophisticated deception. Fake field boundaries were painted across runways, visible in surviving Luftwaffe reconnaissance photos as black geometric lines attempting to disguise landing areas. 3 large hangars received disruptive camouflage patterns. But here's where British deception doctrine diverged from simple concealment. Some camouflage was deliberately imperfect. A A false hedgeline painted across the runway was visible in Luftwaffe photographs. The Germans saw it, they noted it, and they still struggled to bomb the facility effectively because the eye couldn't separate deliberate deception from genuine features. Was that tree line real or painted? That field boundary actual or camouflage? The uncertainty degraded targeting even when detection succeeded. Texture was as important as colour. In some cases, stone or wood chips were applied in binding medium to roof surfaces, creating three-dimensional variation that changed how light reflected. Flat surfaces caught uniform illumination, immediately suspicious. Textured surfaces scattered light irregularly, mimicking natural terrain. The Women's Voluntary Service, which swelled to over 1 million volunteers by 1943, spent countless hours tying strips of sacking to netting in a process called garnishing, creating massive camouflage nets that covered entire complexes. These weren't simple canvas drapes. They were engineered three-dimensional structures that broke up building silhouettes whilst allowing ventilation and access. The most ambitious deception program wasn't defensive camouflage but offensive counter-deception. Starfish sites. Following Coventry's near destruction in November 1940, Turner was ordered to create decoys for 7 major cities: Bristol, Crewe, Derby, London, Manchester, Middlesbrough, and Sheffield. The program expanded explosively. By the 23rd of January 1941, 43 sites protected 13 cities. By March, over 100 sites were operational. At war's end, 237 Starfish sites defended 81 locations. Starfish sites weren't hiding installations, they were simulating them. Located approximately 4 miles from protected targets, close enough to be believable, far enough to spare civilians, these elaborate constructs used controlled fires and lighting to mimic burning cities. The theory exploited German tactical doctrine. Bomber crews were ordered to add incendiary bombs to any fires already burning, concentrating destruction and overwhelming fire services. Captured Luftwaffe airmen confirmed this practice, so the British gave them fires to chase. The original Starfish site, constructed on Blackdown in the Mendip Hills to protect Bristol, used creosote and water fires to simulate exploding incendiaries. Glow boxes mimicked streets and railways, powered by Coventry Climax petrol engines driving electrical generators housed in 2 control bunkers. Control bunkers weren't observation posts, they were bomb-proof shelters. 9-inch concrete roofs over brick walls with earth berms piled around them. Inside, control rooms with telephones and mechanical switches, bunk beds for crews who'd wait through raids, escape hatches for emergencies, and stove bases for fires to keep operators warm whilst they deliberately attracted enemy ordnance. The tactical execution was sophisticated. As German bombers approached, decoy city lights would illuminate, visible from miles out. Once raiders were committed, lights would be extinguished, simulating blackout enforcement, with a few accidental beams pointed skyward to attract attention. Electronic countermeasures confused German radio navigation, and the lead aircraft, believing they'd found their target, would drop their bombs. At that moment, the nearest Starfish site would ignite its fire baskets, remotely triggered from control bunkers positioned 1,000 yards away. Fuel fed automatically from on-site oil tanks. To German crews following behind, it appeared their pathfinders had successfully started major fires. Following doctrine, they added their ordnance to what they believed was concentrated destruction. They were bombing empty moorland. One Starfish operator, a man named Bright protecting Weston-super-Mare, exemplified the program's audacity and danger. As German bombers approached, he activated the decoy fires. They caught rapidly, too rapidly. Before he could return to the control bunker, the raiders redirected their full attention to the Starfish site. Bright found himself exposed in an open field, whilst high explosives and incendiaries rained down. He survived by crawling through ditches, arriving filthy but unscathed. The next morning, his colleagues counted 42 high explosive craters and 1,500 incendiary bomb fins across the site. The citation for his medal noted, Due to reasons of national security, details of the act for this award cannot be disclosed. But the king knew. Bright received his decoration at Buckingham Palace on the 5th of April 1941. Weston-super-Mare was badly hit that night, but the majority of the raid was diverted because a man deliberately made himself a target. Official estimates recorded 730 bombing raids diverted to decoy sites. Historian Colin Dobinson's conservative research suggests Starfish decoys attracted 968 tons of German bombardment. Recent archaeological investigations indicate some sites successfully displaced up to 5% of German bombing efforts in their areas. That figure sounds modest until you remember each ton of ordnance diverted was a ton that didn't hit workers, didn't destroy machine tools, didn't kill engineers, and didn't disrupt production. While Starfish sites simulated urban conflagrations, Q sites and QL sites protected specific installations. Q sites, the designation likely borrowed from Q ships, armed merchant vessels disguised as civilian craft, used lights mounted on poles to simulate airfields at night. When Germans began using incendiary bombs, Turner added fires, creating QF sites. QL sites, quick light, used controlled lighting effects to simulate industrial activity. Factory lights, locomotive glows, moving vehicles. The statistics tell the story. Q sites received 359 attacks by the end of 1941. The airfields they were protecting received 358 attacks, essentially even. But here's the critical difference. Bombs falling on Q sites fell on empty land. Bombs hitting real airfields destroyed aircraft, cratered runways, killed ground crews, and disrupted operations. The decoys worked not by preventing attacks, but by dividing them, forcing the Luftwaffe to expend resources bombing phantoms, whilst real installations maintained function. By the end of 1942, 209 Starfish sites and 168 Q sites were operational. In total, nighttime Q sites attracted 521 attacks, of which 173 struck QL and QF installations, deflecting approximately 900 tons of ordnance. Daytime K sites, using dummy aircraft and buildings, attracted 47 attacks, diverting 117 tons of bombs. But the most extraordinary deception wasn't in empty fields. It was disguising working installations whilst production continued beneath the facade. The British government feared that distinctive industrial architecture, uniform rooflines, regular spacing, large unbroken surfaces made factories unmistakable. So they covered them entirely. Consider the scale involved. The Lockheed Vega aircraft plant in Burbank, California, protected using British techniques adapted by Colonel John F. Omer after observing UK operations in 1940, covered its entire factory beneath chicken wire netting and painted canvas. The runway, a dead giveaway, was painted green to resemble grassland. Fake trees were erected with spray-painted chicken feathers representing leaves, some green for new growth, some brown for decay. Fake automobiles, rubber props, were positioned on fake streets. Once complete, Omer flew a War Department general to 5,000 feet and asked him to identify the plant. The general saw only suburbs. In Seattle, Boeing's B-17 bomber factory disappeared beneath 26 acres of fake neighborhood, complete with streets named Synthetic Street and Burlap Boulevard. Actors were hired to walk the rooftop, hanging laundry, and performing wholesome suburban activities. The women photographed walking those fake streets were treading on chicken wire and planks positioned over factory roofs where, below them, bombers were being assembled. This was British doctrine exported wholesale. The film industry skills Turner had mobilised at Shepperton, set building, prop design, painting, lighting theory, were transplanted to American installations after Pearl Harbor demonstrated the threat of strategic bombing. The techniques worked because they exploited a fundamental principle. The human eye, searching from altitude under time pressure, relies on pattern recognition. Disrupt the expected patterns, introduce plausible alternatives, and even trained observers falter. German critics would have argued, correctly, that these deceptions weren't foolproof. Luftwaffe intelligence folders contained pre-war reconnaissance photographs. They knew where factories were located. Some sites, like the Gloucester Aircraft Company, were still marked as targets despite elaborate roof camouflage. So why did the deception work? Because perfect concealment was never the objective. The goal was degradation of targeting accuracy and introduction of operational friction. Consider the decision calculus for a German bomber crew. You've been briefed on a factory's location using pre-war reconnaissance. You approach the area at night. Cloud cover is 6/10. You have perhaps 30 seconds to confirm your position using visible ground features. Your bomb aimer needs river and railway landmarks to calculate the approach. But the river's been broken up with camouflage netting. The railway looks wrong. Is that line even there? The factory roofline you expected to see isn't there. Those fields where fields shouldn't be, are they real or painted? You're committed to the bomb run. Delay means circling back under anti-aircraft fire. Do you drop on uncertain identification? Or do you trust your intelligence and ignore what your eyes are telling you? That uncertainty, that cognitive friction, was the weapon. It didn't prevent bombing, it degraded effectiveness. Bombs dropped with uncertainty spread wider, hit less accurately, and caused less concentrated damage than bombs dropped with confidence. A factory receiving scattered hits could continue operation. A factory receiving concentrated saturation bombing could not. The psychology worked both ways. British defences actively exploited German expectations. Some camouflage was deliberately imperfect, creating plausible confusion. At RAF Coltishall, a fighter station near the coast, camouflage paint on officers' quarters and barrack blocks was visible enough that traces remained visible for decades. The Germans bombed the base repeatedly in early war, but they never achieved the concentrated destruction that adequate intelligence should have enabled. Why? Because effective deception isn't invisibility, it's plausible ambiguity. Moreover, the deceptions evolved with German tactics. When the Luftwaffe employed radio navigational aids, Knickebein, and the sophisticated X-Duret systems, simple visual deception became less effective. So the British added electronic countermeasures using the pre-war BBC television transmitter at Alexandra Palace to jam and spoof German navigation beams. Starfish sites were positioned along German radio beam directions, exploiting the fact that bomber crews, their electronic navigation disrupted, fell back on visual confirmation. When their instruments and their eyes both said target, they dropped their ordnance on carefully positioned decoys. The integrated approach, electronic warfare, visual deception, dummy installations and camouflaged real installations created a defense in depth that no single countermeasure could defeat. German intelligence might know where a factory was located, but getting bombs accurately onto it required navigation systems that were jammed, visual confirmation that was obscured, and target identification that was deliberately confused. Each layer degraded effectiveness. Together they saved thousands of lives and kept British industry functioning through the Blitz. What made British camouflage doctrine succeed whilst German intelligence failed wasn't superior technology or resources. It was understanding that warfare isn't conducted under laboratory conditions. German target folders were compiled from pre-war reconnaissance in clear weather at optimal altitude. They represented reality under ideal circumstances. Combat reality was darkness, cloud cover, smoke, anti-aircraft fire, searchlights, electronic interference, fatigue, fear, and split-second decisions made under mortal pressure. British camoufleurs understood, because their film industry colleagues understood, that perception is contextual. The same scene that looks obviously false in daylight at ground level becomes convincing at altitude in moonlight. Texture that appears crude up close reads as authentic from 12,000 feet. Patterns that seem garish in direct sunlight blend seamlessly under overcast skies. German intelligence collected data under optimal conditions. British deception operated under combat conditions. The difference was lethal for German bomber effectiveness. This wasn't unique to camouflage. Throughout the war, British doctrine consistently prioritised good enough under pressure over perfect under test. The philosophy appeared in tank design, where reliability under field conditions mattered more than theoretical superiority. It appeared in aircraft development, where the Mosquito, wooden, apparently obsolete, outperformed more sophisticated designs because it could be produced faster, maintained easier, and flew missions metal aircraft couldn't. And it appeared in camouflage, where imperfect deception implemented immediately beat perfect deception that required months to deploy. German doctrine, by contrast, pursued theoretical excellence. Their intelligence was meticulous, their target folders were comprehensive, their reconnaissance was thorough, and none of it fully accounted for the messy chaos of actual operations. They knew where British factories were. They had photographs, measurements, and detailed annotations. But knowing a target's location and successfully bombing it are different things, and the gap between them, that operational friction, was where British deception lived. The British camouflage program never received the recognition afforded radar, code breaking, or fighter development. Partly this was intentional. Deception works best when the enemy doesn't know they've been deceived. Target folders continued marking factories that had been disguised because acknowledging the deception would compromise future operations. Starfish sites operated in secrecy, their operators' heroism classified for decades. Ernest Townsend, the artist who turned the Rolls-Royce works into a painted village, isn't mentioned in most histories. Colonel Turner's department at Shepperton doesn't appear in standard war chronologies, but the numbers don't lie. 237 Starfish sites, 730 diverted raids, 968 tons of ordnance falling on moorland instead of machinery, thousands of workers who lived because bombs missed, production that continued because factories survived, and every Spitfire, Hurricane, Lancaster and Merlin engine that rolled off those camouflaged assembly lines contributed to eventual victory. The deeper lesson extends beyond World War II. Modern military doctrine distinguishes between signature management and concealment, but the principle remains: combat effectiveness isn't determined solely by theoretical capability. It's determined by what actually works under operational pressure. A factory that looks like a village doesn't survive because it's actually invisible. It survives because identifying, navigating to, and accurately bombing it becomes sufficiently difficult that bomber crews miss more often than they hit. That's not failure of German competence, it's success of British deception. The Luftwaffe never stopped knowing where British factories were, they just stopped being able to hit them reliably. And in warfare, knowing where your enemy is doesn't matter if you can't effectively engage them. British camouflage ensured that even perfect intelligence couldn't guarantee accurate bombing. That uncertainty, that operational friction, was worth divisions of anti-aircraft guns, squadrons of fighters, and miles of concrete fortification. Because the bombs that missed didn't need to be shot down, and the factories that survived didn't need to be rebuilt. In the end, British factories weren't protected by looking like villages. They were protected by making the Luftwaffe uncertain they'd found the right target, even when they had. That distinction between concealment and confusion defined the difference between theoretical intelligence and operational effectiveness. The Germans knew where to bomb, they just couldn't reliably hit what they knew was there, and that made all the difference.